Hello, welcome to this talk on movement synergies in infants. And we're going to have a look at how infants develop in their movement dynamics and a few things that might be of interest for us to consider when we're looking at infants that don't necessarily move fluidly or fully. We're also going to have a little bit of a focus on the upper limb. And we'll see why, because that helps with lots of other learning dynamics. So let's begin. So what we're going to have a think about is how humans have to create movement in a complex dynamic. A single structure, a single joint, obviously it's very simple to move up and down and forwards and backwards, so to speak. So not much complicated motor processing, motor sensory processing required for that. But we are, of course, a multi-segmented structure, and so in our body we have lots of subunits, all of which are mobile individually, and so all of those structures have to be somewhat collated together and moved in a synchronous manner, first in one direction and then in another and then in another, so that we've got this multitudinous variety of movements possible. So each single segment needs to be able to cooperate within a multi-segmented movement. So to have a perceptual process, a sensory processing dynamic to include many segments requires a lot more brain processing power, if you like. And so this takes a lot of training up, and so you have to start with some smaller movements in some areas, some general movements, and so the infant gradually learns to manage their trunk and then their proximal limbs onto the trunk, and then within limb and within the one limb, between the limbs, between arms and legs, as well as between both arms. So lots of different sorts of dynamics. And in the context of a multi-segmented structure and coordinative process, we're including the head as a limb, if you like. So the stability of that limb onto the trunk is really important. So if we look at lower limbs, obviously we need to think about hip flexion is managed, how knee flexion and those two things come together. So as we move both hip and knee into flexion and then into extension. Upper limb synergy patterns include shoulder and elbow extension and extension of the fingers and the wrist. So flexions of, so we have flexion of the elbow, we can have finger flexion and finger extension. So there's many different possibilities that we can bring into bear. So an infant will start with what are called spontaneous movements, which are not volitionally organized in the first instance. So these general movements, as they've been called, will begin in utero and continue afterwards. And so there's a pattern of how the trunk is moved, how each limb is moved, what movement is going on within the limb, and whether all 5 limbs, if I can put it that way, are moved and engaged, so that you can then observe the infant, you can score its movement potential, and it really gives insight into cerebral tissue health as well. And so your general movement score can be one of the best and earliest ways of picking up cerebral palsy, for example, as that then means that the limb expression is not as it should be. So when we're looking within the limb, when we have a multi-segmented dynamic, the movement or motor strategies is about how you place the limb through the limb rather than just focusing on the end target. So there's a number of ways, if you want to reach out and grab something, that you can achieve that. So you can put the shoulder forwards, the elbow out, and then the wrist forwards to get to a certain point. Or you could in fact put the elbow out, but stretch the arm further and move your whole body around until you've got to the object. So actually you've got a whole variety of potentials. So the infants will try a number of different strategies. It will, in its various spontaneous movements, be having a go at trying different motor synergies. And gradually, as time goes by, there will be a coalition, if you like, or an understanding within the brain as to what pattern led to the easiest success and the easiest repeated success, so that that then becomes your learned motor pattern. And so osteopathically anyway, what we want to ensure is that within that limb, whichever limb we're talking about, that there isn't a soft tissue or any form of myofascial restraint, which is then going to limit the expression attempt of movement. So if the infant is able to have these spontaneous movements expressed fully through the limbs, then they can essentially experience a whole variety of potential motor synergies within the limb, and therefore come up with which one is going to be more successful for task A or task B. So we can immediately start to think within limb. We also could work within the boundaries of limb axial interface. And so in evolutionary terms, which we can talk about on another lecture, the role of the upper limb as part of the rib cage and respiratory dynamic is well established. And if you want to then improve the strategies and the synergies potential within your upper limbs, then you should also look at your respiratory dynamic. And so this isn't simply just as the arm lifts, the ribs should be stretched. It's a deep-seated motor patterning within the central nervous system about how you recruit certain muscles for respiratory efficiency. So if the infant is having to focus a lot on respiratory management, there may be less processing power for the upper limb. And so to improve upper limb variability and potential synergy exploration, then again, you might wish to look at respiratory dynamics. Another interesting thing, of course, is the hand reflexes. And so we want to really think about how we're looking at fingers, hands, and the even expression of the first instance, the palmar grasp reflex. This is a really interesting one and is possibly forgotten when we're looking at a whole number of things which we might be considering with respect to the upper limb and shoulder girdle. And so even if someone's got torticollis, someone's got respiratory difficulties, someone's got head and neck asymmetry, and you're working through this region, these muscles and the synergies through that arm are actually going to be informed by the dynamics of the grip. Because the grip, evolutionary-wise, has come from a brachiation background. So brachiation likely came before bipedalism, and as humans swinging, we possibly not, we've lost some of our brachiation potential, but the way that the grip then fortifies up into the shoulder motor synergy is really important. And so infants have this huge relationship that if they can then grip, that informs the potential motor synergies within the arm. And so that's going to be an important consideration as to how their hands are able to express, how their fingers are able to move, functionality, excuse me, through those four limb muscles. It's going to be very interesting when we're looking at how the upper limb is organizing itself as a whole. And so here we've got just a few interesting pictures of the grasp reflex in infants, pretty powerful motor sensory dynamic. This sort of thing obviously is ultimately useful for how infants are then going to manipulate objects. Now, object manipulation is a huge dynamic for learning, and you learn to have spatial awareness, which we'll come back to, by your initial object manipulation. And this is done with your upper limbs, because your upper limbs can bring the object to you and start to manipulate it in front of your eyes so that you can build up your vision spatial awareness also. So your upper limbs are forming a purpose beyond the literal grasp of an object. They are informing spatial awareness circuitry which is going to be critical for other ongoing learnings and cognitions subsequently. And the grips that we go through are, there's a whole variety of claw grips, finger grips, even gripping with your palms, in order to eventually have a whole series of things that we can do in terms of fine motor control. But initially, the infant is using sort of gripping for object manipulation, but also ultimately going to be to cross the midline. So crossing the midline means using both hemispheres, and they do this first with the upper limb. So the upper limb is a dynamic which really enables a huge informative dynamic into the whole of the cortical structures, the balance structures, the swing structures. Now, I'm not suggesting that all infants need to literally be made to swing, but we need to think about the feed forward dynamics of upper limb structures and how we have developed the neural networks that we have in evolutionary terms means we can still be informed by that as we go forwards. So I think the way that we utilize play with infants through their upper limbs is perhaps a pretty underutilized dynamic. And I think that we should be using arm grip contacts and play with the infant, as well as other forms of coordination training. And for adults, if you've got any shoulder-based problems, then you can do all sorts of grip strength training and brachiation training if you're up to it, but certainly grip strength training will really help to inform the motor synergies through that upper limb. So shoulders are really interesting. So I mentioned that the upper limb bimanual dexterity is informative across the hemispheres. And one of the reasons is that in utilizing both upper limbs together and bringing them into the midline so that we can have object manipulation and using visual circuitry as well as improving our dexterity, it's also going to help us develop our corpus callosum. Now, if we have by using both hands, we have to use the motor circuitry from both sides of our cortex in order to appreciate what's going on. So we inform a huge swathe of the cortex by developing the corpus callosum, and the upper limb interactions really help with this interhemispheric communication. Now, that obviously not only helps with the complex movement development, but as it starts to grow through the cortex and inform a huge swathe along the cortex, it helps, yes, our physical behaviors, but our physical behaviors are also then linked into our emotional intelligence and how we can use the informed parts of our brain to do something beyond just object manipulation, but to consider social context and emotional manipulation, engagement, observation, and dexterity, if you like. So in complex social circumstances where we have to have a huge spatial awareness and establish interrelationships between people within this complex arena, we've already set up our corpus callosum by the initial training with our upper limb dexterity to inform through the corpus callosum both sides of our hemispheres, which, as we know, work differently anyway. And it's about being able to communicate across the hemispheres, between the hemispheres, not just within one hemisphere or within the other, but between and then within and back and within, that informs our essential cognitive and emotional competence. So that's a lot for upper limbs to manage, isn't it? But so anyway, getting a little bit back down into the limbs then, when we use ultimately our whole upper limbs with walking and locomotion, there's a whole variety of stuff which also occurs through the rest of the body. So it's not just object manipulation and vision, and we'll come to vision in a minute, but that object manipulation is only one task. We then have to do locomotion. we have to balance ourselves in a three-dimensional space. And we first have to do this on our back, which I know doesn't require much balancing in a gravitational sense, but allows us to look at interlimb and limb trunk coordination. And so the upper limb is part of this initial training of three-dimensional balance and three-dimensional body awareness. And what it's initially doing is building up, of course, the corticospinal tracts. And the corticospinal tracts, as you know, come from one side and go across to the other, or the vast majority do. There are some parts of the corticospinal tracts, the lateral tracts, which are then still ipsilaterally informing. So not all corticospinal tracts go to the opposite. There are also still some ipsilateral tracts, which are part of the mix also. And so you need lots of complex movements in order to fully develop all descending and then decussating, as well as non-decussating corticospinal tracts. As they get past under the medulla in that region before they then desiccate, there is some other input from cerebellar and other structures which come in, and there's also an information through into not just the motor output, but into the propriospinal tracts within the spinal cord. And these propriospinal tracts within the spinal cord are then going to have their own processing to develop. So you not only inform motor execution circuits, but then you use a good training of the propriospinal tract within the spinal cord itself, so that you have a huge possibility for central pattern generation established within the spinal cord, so that the spinal cord can manage movement patterns without having to necessarily always rely fully on the descending tracts. So there's a real link between spinal cord processing and descending tract information that ultimately leads to successful and variable motor outputs. So when we look at the way that the infants develop movement, as I say, they start with doing these spontaneous general movements, and you can observe the patternings of those. Then they will move on to other different movements, and they can start by finding other parts of their body. So self-exploration, touch comes into play, and when they find their ipsilateral leg, they can then do different things with their ipsilateral legs. So initially they can move that leg up, so and then they can, if they grab hold of the other one, they can do different things with each ipsilateral set of limbs. And so there's a whole load of ancestral movement patterns, homolateral, contralateral, homologous, etc. And so the infant will go through a whole series of sequencing with their advanced general movements, and also with their postural reflexes, and using their sitting reflexes, postural sitting reflexes, but also STNR, crawling, hands and knees, movement dynamics, to look at how the corticospinal tracts and the propriospinal tracts in the spinal cord are then going to manage varying interlimb coordinations and limb coordinations onto trunk. And it's an interesting thing when we think of how each limb, so the movement between limbs is obviously developed. You can then get hold of your opposite toe, pull your opposite toe up, cross the midline, and so on. And so there's information from one limb coming through to the other, which will inform from this limb through to the limb that you're about to go and engage on. As you move this limb, other limbs are also starting to be engaged in a patterning dynamic, so that you're not even moving the upper limbs, but already those motor neurons are firing, so that you can try out what you need to do in three-dimensional space in order to achieve your movement synergy or your movement goal. So as you move one limb, other limbs are already activated. So this is, obviously understandable in a volitional or active movement exploration dynamic, but it's also true, especially with infants, that if the infant's limb is passively moved, then that passive movement, that proprioceptive experiencing, those afferents that fire off, will still trigger motor efferent patternings and firings in the non-moved limb. So passive movement will improve motor responsiveness in other limbs not being passively moved. And so there's all sorts of debates in manual therapy about, hands-on care being pointless, and unless the person does the movement themselves, then it's meaningless, and your soft tissue dynamics and your physical therapist movement is not informative. Well, it actually is. And so I think osteopathically, what we're trying to do as we're looking at movement symmetries, and we're exploring for movement resistances or differences in tone and suppleness in the infant, where we find those differences and where we work on them with our techniques, which are passive for the infant. The infant simply experiences the practitioner delivered dynamics. Those practitioner delivered dynamics are talking through the nervous system, through into other limbs and structures and nervous system areas beyond the point which you're touching. So I think this is really interesting to remember that you'll get, so if I'm working on the wrist, the shoulder motor synergies will start to react in the shoulder, so within the ipsilateral limb, but also within the contralateral limb. You will get, working here will make other activities in arm or leg activate. So I think that it's certainly true that we can speak through to the nervous system in a reflexive manner, in a motor network, a distributed manner, rather than saying it's just the local range of motion and soft tissue muscle stretch story that I'm talking about. So this is our understand. Now we need to understand that we move beyond the local and back into the diffuse, so that we're talking to the body as a whole when we work with one area. So we can rest assured that as we work here, it's speaking to many areas of the body and brain. So then that enables the body and the brain to work out what it makes of that newfound sensory information that we've introduced, so that hopefully it can get back to its motor synergies, and then hopefully sequence those motor synergies into a coordinated motor planning, so that we then have combined movement, such as how the infant learns to roll. And so there's a nice paper which explains how the infant uses various either ipsilateral, homologous, or homolateral and contralateral movements in and between different limbs in order to achieve the whole body momentum and reorganization to begin to roll. So when we're looking at how all of the infant is trying to learn, if we remove all these barriers to movements, then we improve the interlimb and the intra-limb and the limb trunk potential, so that the infant can explore better three-dimensionally and come up with the most successful strategy for learning other things such as rolling and so on. Obviously, then that brings, as soon as you start to roll in particular, it's that then places your vision into a different frame. And once you've obviously organized head stability, and then you can bring your vision onto other things in your environment. So rather than relying on you bringing objects to you, you can then place your whole body orientation in three-dimensional space, bringing that vision potential towards other things, which you can then, of course, reach out to. So when we're looking at motor learning, we certainly have these sequences of primitive reflexes, and osteopathically we're looking to remove barriers in the tissues, sensory barriers, so that motor expression can be triggered more diffusely and dynamically through the infant body without hindrance, so that they can then experience these movements in a good way, so that their attempts at movement coordination aren't hindered by soft tissue tensions through their body, and so they can explore more successfully. So as they build up their competence with using combined primitive reflexing, it then becomes much more volitional, and their volitional attempts at coordinating movements gradually becomes more and more successful. So it's rolling to sit. It's then obviously ultimately going to be crawling, but it's also then sitting. So one of the ideas of rolling is that you can gradually roll to sit. Once you can sit, then you can return to your object manipulation, but now in a different gravitational alignment. So as you sit, you then have to differently posturally organize to then be able to manage your manipulation of objects and then reach out for them, get them, and so on. And so when we're looking at this type of bending, not only is it doing interesting things within the cruciates and knee ligaments and hip ligaments and so on, and building up those structures in these postures, it's also then, of course, bringing different pressure effects through the trunk. So there's going to be a different loading on the respiratory system here. There's going to be a different loading on the gastrointestinal tract here, and also on fluid return mechanisms within the trunk. So actually, these hand manipulations are enabled by the ability of the trunk to be stacked up and by the ability of the head to be stabilized. So actually, if you want to help motor learning, what you need to do is look at trunk stability and intra-trunk, intracoelomic and visceral fluidic dynamics and how those are stabilized in order to then provide a stable base on which the head can then be stabilized, so that then the body can then be moved as a unit in three-dimensional space to enable your hand reaching to get various objects to continue your spatial awareness story. So ultimately, we're going to build up a whole set of three-dimensional, often spiral motor patterns, but we can ultimately each develop quite a variety of motor synergies to develop something such as walking. So this is a study which looked at which motor parts and which movement dynamic zones you used more when you worked forwards. And so with lots of sensors placed everywhere, we can look at, as people walk, they have completely different motor strategies and motor recruitment dynamics and synergies that they have developed, and each of them outwardly look to be walking forwards, but the motor planning and execution in a multi-segmented structure such as a human body has now been able to demonstrably develop a whole variety of ways of achieving the same goal. So this is what we want for our children as they're developing, is not only in when we think about ultimately locomotion, we want to then think of interlimb coordination and then within trunk twist in order to support interlimb coordination. And so there's a lot of hierarchy of movements so that you build that from trunk first, trunk limb, and then obviously standing. When you first stand, you sort of regress a bit because now the processing of bringing lower limbs in with trunk and upper limbs means that that's a lot more processing. So temporarily, you're a bit less good with your dexterity, if you like, and your spatial awareness, because now you're bringing your leg information into the mix. So it takes a while from infants and then young children to regroup and retain their prior competence in one activity as they then bring much more three-dimensional gravitational dynamics into bearing. Now, ultimately, we're going to do complex things like throwing and, much more dynamics whereby we have to shift our center of gravity across and still maintain limb dexterity and strategy potential. So it's one thing to stand upright and throw, but even that act will shift your center of gravity a little bit. And that then means that you will have to recruit your trunk postural muscles a lot. So if you recruit your trunk postural muscles, that means you're using your diaphragm, because your diaphragm is a hugely postural muscle. It's not just a respiratory muscle, but of course, if you start to use your diaphragm for movement strategies for throwing in the upper limb, now you've stopped it being utilized so much for your respiratory capacity. So now you have to retrain your respiratory motor patterning dynamics and movement synergies. So as you add further complexities of movement, you then have to help the infant reorganize themselves sensorially. So one of the key things for having a variable diaphragm is to actually get good head stabilization. So actually, one of the things that you can do with your infants is to assess them sitting. Why lay them down? What's that going to do to help them? So really, you shouldn't have your infant laying down, because what you want to do is be informed by the tensionality patterns that they have as they're trying to organize themselves gravitationally and stabilize the head on the trunk. Because without head stabilization on the trunk, then you can't do upper limb dexterity. You then can't do upper limb wider movements, and then you can't organize your limbs and head for locomotion with your trunk. So actually working on the head in a sitting dynamic, or looking at that head trunk organization, is something that's going to inform all of their interlimb coordination patterns later. Now, we've talked quite a bit about limb dynamics and dexterity and sort of visual spatial awareness. So you absolutely need good limbs to build up your vision. So good hands in the first instance to build up your vision, because what you first of all need to do is to build up your binocular vision and your spatial awareness. So without the spatial awareness visually, which you train from your object manipulation from the hands in the first instance, without you building up your visual fields and your visual circuitry in this way, then as the infant is still, but something's moving across in front of it, it lags behind in its ability to process that information. And so in terms of building up their own sense of self and their own movement in three-dimensional space, their vision has to track in motion. And so you first start building that up with having really good object manipulation. So you want to make sure that their both upper limbs and their wrists can do all sorts of interesting things in order to help that vision. So working on your vision then is the next step in terms of your global motor movement strategies. And so when you look at vision, what you've got to then think of is the physical space of the optic tracts and the globes. And so that's when we think about looking at your visual attention and things like your asymmetric tonic neck reflex. Is that evenly expressed? If not, why not? What can you do? And we can then also look at growth within the faciocranial skeleton, and to look at whether you end up with facial symmetry, because this is going to place the globe at different distances and potentially slightly different alignments, requiring a different visual accommodation in order to then be able to focus on object manipulation. So it's going to affect your spatial awareness potential. So humans have a very overlapping binocular vision, and to give a really different sort of spatial awareness. And this is really important for goal-directed learning, because if you can bring both eyes to focus on a goal, a task, then your whole of your cortex, your motivational circuitry, volitional circuitry, your homeostatic circuitry, arousal circuitry to go for that goal, do it, try it, fail, redo it, try it, learn it, embed it, memorize it, etc. All of that dynamic, first of all, is about bringing your eyes together and starting that spatial awareness. And so actually looking at gaze stabilization from the perspective of the craniofacial dynamics is a really important thing to get organized osteopathically as early as possible. So that whole goal-directed learning is your motivation for anything else. As soon as you want to go crawling along the floor, getting yourself up off the floor, learning to look at things, learning to speak and babble, you need these goal-directed dynamics, and vision is an important part of that. It's not the only part of that. Obviously, there's the sensory experiencing of moving your whole body three-dimensionally. So body comfort is a huge part of volition and motivation for wanting to literally move yourself off that mat and go and find whatever else is over there. And so sensory experiencing and comfort then gives you the ideation that your body could do a thing, that you can start to learn to trust your body to perform in movement. And that then means, as you start to have confidence in your body, you want to move more and quicker and more energetically and differently energetically, which of course means that you're training up your autonomic recruitment of your body's metabolic dynamics and circulatory dynamics to support that movement potential. So there's a lot in movement that is physiological from the rest of the body to give you that energy for, motivation for, and then metabolic and nutritional supply for movement success. So if you do it best, well supported, then you're more likely to achieve. If you achieve, you get your reward circuits built in, and you get all sorts of different neurotransmitters. You get emotional experiences from achieving, and even if you fail sometimes, then you still have motivation enough to try again, and so on. So movement strategy is really interesting. And when we think of how we're going to help develop the infant, and we've got someone coming in with a hip twist or a slightly molded body, or they're not crawling three-dimensionally, what we really want to think of is of all of the ways in which movement develops. And hopefully this little talk has given you some additional factors to think of when you're looking at unwinding, if you like, your infant, your child in front of you in your clinic. All right, thank you very much for listening.